Hi everyone, this is going to be a little bit different to my previous videos. I've decided to start a series called the Scribbler Schoolhouse where we'll cover study skills and topics I hope will help with revision, coursework, homework and whatever else the education system throws at you. Basically, it looks like people are going to have at least a year of school disrupted because of lockdowns and online school, so I want to help out however I can. What I want to cover here is analysis skills and writing techniques. It's really easy to get on the internet and look up the answers. If your homework is about the First World War, then you can just go on Wikipedia and find all the information. What is harder to learn from the internet is how to use that knowledge in your own work. It's harder to grasp those skills over the internet. It's harder to teach them, and also that you lose the opportunity to ask so many questions. So if you've been doing your best but you're looking at your work and feeling a bit lost, then I hope this series will be useful. This is primarily a history channel. I started during my public history degree to try and put some of the theories I've been learning into practice after all my work experience opportunities dried up. Anyway, so I'll mostly be covering topics to help with history. However, I also have half a degree in English literature, so hopefully expect some videos to help with GCSE and A-Level English. Anyway, that's enough housekeeping. Time to dive into today's topic, which is a question that crops up all across the history curriculum. How useful is this source? This is a question that can be tricky at first. We've moved on from explaining how things happened in the past, and now we need to think about how we know these things happened. We need to pull together our own knowledge and our analysis skills and apply that to an unfamiliar source. It's a lot. First, I think it's good to look at why examiners and teachers ask you this question. The truth is that studying history is about a lot more than just remembering dates and historical figures and what they did and when. Most of it is actually looking at the random scraps that people have left behind and putting them together to make the best educated guesses about what their lives were like. History is a bit like doing a giant jigsaw, except that half the pieces are missing and some of the remaining crucial ones have half rotted away or someone covered them in irremovable paint. And so every time you look at a source, you have to think about what it can tell you and what it can't tell you. Is it surrounded by missing pieces? Does it only show one small part of the jigsaw? Is half of it too damaged to look at properly? How useful will it be when you're trying to see the overall picture of your jigsaw puzzle? Basically, the usefulness question wants you to think about how much a particular source can tell you about a past event. Teachers are usually very keen for you to write about bias, or if the source is only showing one side to the story. But there are other things that make a source useful or not, like when it was produced, what physical material it was created on, who it was created for, and what it was used for at the time. There is also to think about, and therefore there are lots of different things you could talk about when writing a good answer. One problem I think with the how useful is this source for historians question is that it makes it seem like historians are searching for that perfect, universally useful source that will give them all the answers to every historical inquiry. Unfortunately, that source doesn't exist. Actually, all sources are useful in their own special little way, and historians work by putting them all together until they get a pretty good idea of what happened. Let's look at an example source and cover what to watch out for. The basic outline of what to do is to first annotate it to find patterns and interesting details, then to think about who made it, when, and who it was aimed at, and then to think about the source alongside your own knowledge. Say we have a question on how the First World War affected people's lives, and the first source is this one. As this is a written source, let's start with underlining some words that tell us about how this person felt after the declaration of war. Once we've spotted some patterns, we can pull them together and draw some conclusions. He talks about excitement twice and how this called his spirit of adventure. He calls the other soldiers brave boys and suggests he wants to be brave too. The mention of displays of patriotism is interesting because it suggests a big motivation for going to fight, especially when he says he joined up to specifically serve my king and country. This feeling was throughout the country, so we can guess that lots of other people felt the same way too. One thing that might stand out is that this source was written in 1926, a full 12 years after the events it described took place. You could say this reduces the overall usefulness because the person might have forgotten what it was like after so many years. However, it is important to read the full details given to you. This source is based on a diary kept during the war. This would have helped jog his memory about what happened. As this is a personal account, this source is useful for understanding this person's motive for signing up. A different drawback might be that the soldier might not have been so open in his published memoir compared to his personal diary. He might have decided not to make public some of the things he secretly felt at the time. Which brings us to the introduction of our own knowledge. Patriotism and the excitement of going to serve the country was a famous example of the reasons people signed up to fight. It was a remnant of 19th century ideas about war, but it wasn't the only reason, and this source doesn't mention anything about how people might have signed up to be guaranteed a good wage, clothing and food, which might have been difficult to access in the early 20th century. If we wanted to know more about these reasons for signing up, we'd have to look elsewhere. Let's compare this source to one of my favourites produced during the First World War. This is a cartoon of how the fictional Brown family Christmases changed between 1914 and 1917. Again, let's do some annotating. We can see that it was a gradual change, but nonetheless, the war changed a lot about the family's lifestyle. They no longer have servants, and instead everyone is doing something to help the war effort. Their plentiful dinner table is now looking very empty, with a ration book instead. We can say this source is useful for telling us about the ways the war affected people's daily lives, from their occupation to their food. It can also tell us about their attitude towards the war. Like the memoir we looked at earlier, they began enthusiastically and optimistically. But what's interesting is that as their lives changed dramatically, they kept up this optimism and good spirit. We can say that this source is useful for telling us about people's attitudes towards the war, which was positive and persevering. But wait a second, remember our second step, which is to think about why and how this source was produced. We can tell this is a cartoon and not a representation of a real family Christmas. These kinds of cartoons might have been distributed in newspapers or periodicals and pictorials, which were like magazines that printed jokes, pictures, and the newest chapters from the latest blockbuster novel. This cartoon was published in the last issue of a pictorial before Christmas, and it is surrounded by silly jokes. Honestly, they're kind of relatable and even include this excellent weather pun. But what we can tell from this is that the author of this cartoon was trying to make a joke about a bit of a rubbish situation. You don't need to know exactly where the source came from, I just wanted to put it into context so you know where these kind of cartoons might have appeared. What we can read between the lines is that people needed to be cheered up because they were feeling down about how the war had changed their lives. This is where our own knowledge comes in. We can use it to fill the gaps about why people might have wanted to make morale-boosting jokes. But you could talk about rationing, air raids, trench conditions, or fatalities. The source isn't very useful for telling us about that, but it is useful for telling us how people wanted to keep an optimistic attitude, at least in public. So, gathering everything together, this is what you need to look out for when you're studying a source for a usefulness question. 1. A topic you want to know more about. This should be specified in the question. In our case, we want to know more about people's attitudes towards the First World War at the time. 2. The relevant details in the source. This is where you analyse the source itself, looking for phrases and components relevant to the question. Don't be afraid to do lots of annotating. 3. The detail about the source's creation. This has a big impact on how useful the things you identified in step 2 are. There are lots of different things to consider. Who wrote the source? Were they there at the time? Were they involved in the action? When was the source created? Was it a long or short time after the event? What medium is the source? Is it written down or drawn? A photograph, a cartoon, a diary entry, shopping list, an archaeological remain? All these things are good at telling us some things about the past and not so good at others. Who was the source written for? Was it a knowledgeable audience? Was it for an informal audience? What tone was the source's author trying to convey? Did they just want to get across the facts, or did they want to make the person feel something? Were they making jokes, or were they being deadly serious? 4. How the source compares with your own knowledge of history. This doesn't need to be a really long section full of facts and figures. It is good to use own knowledge to demonstrate the limitations of a source's usefulness. For example, that it cannot or does not consider another factor. You can also use this section to prove that a source is useful. The source tells us about a certain thing and we know that that thing did indeed happen. And finally, it's time for a bonus section of Scribbler top tips. This question is all about the source. You need to constantly pull details from the source and analyse them. This is not a question where you showcase all your knowledge. Don't just say a few lines about the source and then talk about everything you already know about the topic. That isn't what the question wants you to do. Make sure you read and consider all the information given to you, such as when it was made and by who. There might be additional details there. It's all given to you for a reason, and you need to think about how this information affects your understanding of the source's usefulness. Make sure you talk about what makes the source useful and what makes it not very useful. At the end, place it in an overall position on the spectrum of usefulness, using words like somewhat, not very, and extremely. But what if I'm struggling to analyse the source in that much detail? Now that is a very valid concern. When you're busy worrying about remembering everything you've learned and how you're supposed to answer the questions, it can be difficult to come up with good things to say about the source. First, I want to offer reassurance that there are loads and loads of ways to answer these questions. You don't need to write down the answer to all the questions you might ask yourself. If you can only think of a few different points, that should be okay, as long as you're constantly referencing back to the source. Second, the best way to get better at these types of questions is to practice. It's okay if you find it hard to come up with things at first. If you're still really struggling, then I would recommend watching and reading things from professional historians who use these skills on a daily basis. A good documentary is Mary Beard's Meet the Romans, which you can find on BBC iPlayer every so often. She looks at all kinds of different sources like inscriptions, poems and statues, and she talks about what they can tell us about the past and what they are not so good at telling us. There you are. Think about all these things and you should have a pretty thorough plan which you can adapt to the exact question and mark scheme you're up against. I really hope you found this video useful. If there is something you want to see covered, then please drop it in the comments and I'll do my best to make a video about it as soon as I can.